And so without further ado, let me introduce my friend Jesse, who is came from Swarthmore, which is a really good feeder for applied behavioral scientists, mostly because Barry Schartz turned many of us on to fun things, although there's a number of really great professors there. And so, Jesse, I'll give you a chance to sort of introduce a little bit about yourself. You've come back to Philly, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. So tell us a little bit about, your career in behavioral science.
Well, right now I'm a behavioral scientist at Indeed. Got my Indeed branded mug right here as proof. Indeed, as many of you I'm sure know from all of the ads on your Spotify, is a job site, the world's #1 job site. So I spend my time there thinking about how to change job seeking and hiring behavior. Before Indeed, I have bounced around a number of different companies of all industries and sizes. I had a stint in insurance, in investment research. I had a startup that dealt entirely with telephone payments, which was about as niche as it sounds, and a brief internship at a behavioral science consultancy too. So through that very scenic route, I like to say that I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of applied behavioral science over the last couple of years.
And so let's rewind it to the beginning, since we both went to Swarthmore, and you've repping Indeed. We got to rep Swarthmore. Don't you have any swag? Come on, we need like the Garnet T-shirt or something. So you're at SWAT. What are you majoring in? Like, how do you do you like randomly take a class in this? You like know you want to take a class in this? Like, where did this start for you?
So Swarthmore planted the seed of applied behavioral science many years before I actually started doing it. When I was in college, I studied political theory, political philosophy, and I mean like pure political philosophy. Never saw a statistic until my junior or senior year. Had very limited exposure to social science, let alone behavioral science, until I had to complete some departmental requirements. I was really interested in the relationship between democracy and capitalism, how we have some things that are considered the role of government, some things that are considered the role of the private sector to manage, and those lines change over time for better or for worse, depending on who you ask. Now, you mentioned Barry Schartz. He enters the story around my junior year when I hear that there's this guy in the psych department who spends a lot of his time dunking on, as the kids say, sort of traditional economic models of human behavior. So insofar as I was interested in critiques of the private sector or limitations of traditional economic reasoning that go on there, I decided to take a class with Barry Schartz. And that was where I kind of got hooked. I continued on doing the whole political science thing post-grad and thought for a very long time that I wanted to get a PhD in that and go into academia. Fast forwarding a little bit here, I had an absolutely abysmal time in a master's program, and then
in political theory.
Yeah, basically. I found out that academia was not for me. And so on the way in, when I started thinking, I want to do something with political theory, talk about great ideas of right and wrong and how to organize society. On the way out, I realized I want to do something different. And the whole time that I had been reading like Hannah Arendt and Friedrich Nietzsche during my day job, I had been continuing to read the stuff that Barry Schartz had recommended, kind of on the side. And so I ended up writing my.
Time out.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, I had an abysmal time. What didn't fit? What didn't feel good? Like, there's a lot of folks here who you know me, I was in a PhD program, dropped out. There's a lot of people who went that academic route and then for one reason or another sort of bounced out of it.
Sure.
Push on that a little bit. Like, what happened that made you go, oh man, this is just not where I want to be?
A couple things. I ended up in an institution that shall remain nameless that is known for being where fun goes to die. It is I believe that's on a T-shirt.
And
Uh,
to be clear, this is coming from Swarthmore, which has been voted by Playboy the ugliest campus for the last like 50 years running. We're not exactly the party people to begin with.
yeah, it was. I had an intense time as an undergrad, and my year and a half in graduate school was even more so. Uh, Mostly the big difference being as an undergraduate, I found it very collaborative. In graduate school, it was very competitive, or at best, people working in silos. I didn't really find an advisor who I clicked with and didn't really have a sense of community, which incidentally is one of the things that I really like about being an applied behavioral scientist. You know, there are folks like everybody on this call who, you know, get together and talk about ideas, support each other. Didn't really have that as a graduate student. I also found that I did not like writing academic papers, which is, you know, probably something that you have to enjoy or at least tolerate in order to succeed in that field. So for all those reasons, on my way in, I thought I was going to, you know, write about political philosophy for the rest of my life, and I decided to pivot and wrote about this hot new political topic that was going on at the time. This was at the end of the Obama administration, and that was the rise of the behavioral insights team in the UK, the behavioral science wing of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US, and kind of a take on what is it about how people think about the private sector and government today in 2015, 2016 that is allowing this thing to take off. So it was a kind of a blend of what I had been thinking about, you know, on the way into the program, full time, and the ideas that I had picked up from Barry Schartz and kind of continued to keep on the back burner. Um, and I was able to use that thinking and writing to make a career in behavioral science, which, you know, a few steps later leads me to where I am today.
And
That's
so you write this thesis that's sort of like behavioral science focused.
yeah.
Where do you go from there? Where do you start looking? Like, did you immediately know, hey, I wrote this thesis, I really do, I thought I decided I want to do this thing, and I go on LinkedIn and I'm searching applied behavioral science jobs? Like, how do you make that transition out of academia into your first job?
Uh, complete and total luck. Complete and total luck. As I'm telling the narrative here, it sounds like a nicely, you know, linear progression of steps that cohere and make sense. Hindsight bias, of course, you know, it gets us all. Um, so as I tell this, I try to remember, you know, how much of this was luck and happenstance. Um, the luck in this case was during my last semester in grad school, I was sitting in the back of a class pizza party um, where everybody was eating pepperoni pizza except for me and the guy sitting next to me. He's like, why aren't you eating the pizza? Oh, I'm vegan. Oh, hey, I'm vegetarian. I'm Jesse. Nice to meet you. Guy sitting next to me turned out to be the retired CFO of an investment research company who decided to pursue a PhD in political science, just, you know, out of interest.
As
Uh,
one does,
that's one. I guess he had greater fortitude and liked writing better than I did. And I mentioned that I was, you know, coming to the end of my program, looking for a job, and he put me in touch with his former colleagues, and I managed to get an entry-level investment research analyst role. Um, and that was a very formative experience for me as a behavioral scientist or budding behavioral scientist at that point. Because again, I had a day job where I was analyzing these retirement funds, but on the side, I continued thinking and reading about behavioral science, and I realized, holy cow, this investment research department that I'm in, and really the whole industry, is potentially rife with all kinds of biases around how you predict what would be an effective or a lucrative investment, um, who is a qualified or unqualified investment manager, um, how you decide whether or not to keep your money invested in one place or pull it out of one bank and put it in another at the consumer level. Really just a rich area to be to take a knowledge of heuristics and biases and notice opportunities for research and also, changing the way people act. Um, the last thing I'll say is I had the good fortune of uh, running into an actual applied behavioral scientist at that company by the name of Steve Wendell, who taught me an awful lot.
I think he's on the call. There he is. See?
Oh, hi, Steve.
He's around.
Nice to
Hey,
see you.
buddy. Good to see you again.
Likewise. So it was really my luck that I happened to sit next to the guy who put in a good word for me with that job, and that Steve happened to be there, and Steve's generosity and um, speaking with me and mentoring me and giving me advice on these little side projects, behaviorally informed side projects that I cooked up. That was really, I think, the turning point where I started, you know, injecting behavioral science into my day-to-day work.
I like this vision of you, Jesse, as like a rock and roll behavioral scientist. He's like, I'm waiting tables on the day. At night, I'm reading behavioral science theory, and then, my band got big. So presumably this, management fund that you were at was Morningstar?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. For those that don't know, the very famous Steve Wendell, behavioral science, is sort of, how you play 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon? You can play 6 Degrees of Steve Wendell in behavioral science, and we're all sort of 6 degrees from
I think more Matt, but yeah.
6 Degrees of Steve Wendell. So Morningstar, Steve's startup got bought by Morningstar, and so he was there for a very long time, and a tremendous number of really impressive people have come through that team, which grew to be quite large and very well infused into the company, including our friend Jesse. So you're at Morningstar, right? This is Chicago, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, this is Chicago. You're at Morningstar, and then what makes you decide, hey, I'm gonna go to the next place, I'm gonna do the next thing?
So the division that I was in wanted me to focus exclusively on writing these analytical investment reports.
And we know how much you love writing reports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That really was kind of a hang up in my day job, and I asked if I could work more and more with Steve and his team, because I felt like I had some really promising research about how confidence worked in investment analysis, and I was turned down. So I decided to leave because I couldn't pursue what I was really interested in. I sent in a cold application for an entry-level behavioral scientist job at Allstate Insurance, and
I think Florent might be on the call too. Actually, I think.
Right. 6 Degrees. Florent hired me to work in this little subsidiary of Allstate that dealt entirely with auto insurance, completely different from what I had been applying behavioral science to previously. But that was my first job as a titled behavioral scientist.
So I want to push on that, because there's a lot of people on the call who are trying to get that first job that has behavioral science in the name. How'd you find it? Like, what was the interview process like? You can say bad things about Florent here. It's okay. This is a safe space.
I would never, and I have no bad things to say about Florent.
So how'd you find it? Like, were you sort of keeping an eye out for jobs with behavioral science in the name? It was through the community. Like, how did this come about for you?
I think I just searched for behavioral scientist on Google or LinkedIn. I honestly, I probably should have used Indeed, but I found it through a web search and applied cold. and I really doubted whether I would have a shot at it, seeing as I didn't have behavioral scientist in my title. I didn't even have a degree in psychology or economics. I had political science at that point. Um, so I didn't really look like a behavioral scientist on paper. To his credit, Florent interviewed me um, and interviewed me in such a way that I was able to show what I knew at the time and the ways I had been applying behavioral science kind of on as a an additive to my day job, and gave me my first real behavioral scientist job, my first opportunity to do that full time. Um,
To go back to that interview, do you remember, like, is this interview emblazoned in your mind? Do you remember anything from it? Like, how did this is a really common, there's two routes to behavioral science. There's like the official route where like every job you get has behavioral science in the name somewhere, and this is the thing that you do. And a very small number of people go through that door. And a lot of people go through the other door, which is the I do a job that doesn't have behavioral science in the name, but I use behavioral science as a process or methodology. And then I sort of rip off the mask and are like, surprise, it was behavioral science all the time. And so this is your mask ripping off moment, right? You sort of, hey, the thing I was doing at Morningstar didn't have behavioral science in the name, but I was trying to use it as an approach. Then I get to this place where I could take off my mask and say, hey, I really am a behavioral scientist. Do you remember sort of interviewing with Florent? What kind of questions he asked you, sort of how you brought that out?
I do remember a fair part of that interview. I think I recall talking about my interest in confidence and investment analysis as a ripe area of research that I wasn't able to pursue. Um, I rem I remember that Florent also conducted the interview in a very behavioral sciencey way. It was completely structured. He said up front, "Here are the things I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to tell you them now, so there are no surprises." And then went through a structured uh, list of questions. I remember being asked to explain what is a heuristic, and I could, imagine him there with a pencil and a clipboard, with a rubric. Anyway, I point that out because um, it was so different from the other kind of unstructured hiring processes that I had gone through, mostly unsuccessfully to that point. And it's really stuck with me as a better way to hire, and I've kept that in the back of my mind, till the point where I'm at Indeed and actually working on how to apply behavioral science to hiring processes. How can structured hiring be more efficient, fairer, et cetera? Yeah, pretty memorable interview.
So you go through this rubric. Apparently, you checked all the boxes. Florent's ticking them off on the other side. And
Enough
you
of
get,
that. Maybe he's satisfied.
who knows? He was like, good enough. He had another candidate in mind, but it's like any good behavioral scientist, he never tells you. So you get hired. You're at Allstate.
Yep.
What's your title?
Behavioral scientist.
It's just behavioral scientist. No modifiers. Just behavioral scientist. That guy over there. And you come into Florent's team, and what does that mean? What is your first behavioral science job? What are you doing? Like, what's it feel like? How did you get through your first 3, 6, 9 months? Like, tell us a little bit about it.
So it was a little bit like being thrown into the deep end of the pool, and because Florent hired me, but I was in a completely different part of the company. I was in this little auto insurance subsidiary. So Florent's team was in the main, part of the insurance company, and I was tasked with trying to bring behavioral science to a completely different division. So a lot of the time, I would go off on my own, trying to drum up support for behavioral science, identify ways to weave behavioral science into what this little subdivision was doing, then go back and meet with Florent and Mark Lush and Phaedra Daifa, who were there at the time, and say, "Holy cow, guys! How you've been here for much longer than I have, and you've managed to succeed in business development. How did you guys do it?" So I was trying to expand the footprint of behavioral science at Allstate.
And how'd you do that? So you're in this little division, you're weaving it in. How are you, are they coming to you with meetings? Is there, or with projects, is there an ingress process by which they're supposed to, like, how are you engaging with those folks?
I tried to make myself omnipresent. I attended any meeting I could. I gave lunchtime talks about what is behavioral science, how can it help. I met with one-on-one with as many decision makers as I could find, and tried to make the case, for the decisions, this person controls, here's how behavioral science can help. A lot of pitching. Most of the pitches were unsuccessful, I'll say. But
wait, before you move on that,
yeah.
Tell me about unsuccessful pitching. Like, they're interested, but they can't, there's not budget. Like, what's holding you back from sort of like, where do you think, if you could rewind in time, what do you think sort of was leading to that lack of traction?
I think a couple of things. The first thing I'll say is I was pretty junior in my career at that point, and I'm not sure if I had the most effective way to sell what I knew how to do or wanted to do. Can't overlook that as a factor. I think there were also some, if you look at the incentives that the decision makers I was talking to were facing, they were in a relatively new division of Allstate. They themselves were trying to, show rapid success. Why would they take a risk on, some dude who waltzes in and say, "I know about the mind. Let me suggest some different, some changes to your process." So there was some, I think, some maybe status quo bias and worries about a perceived behavioral science as a risk. Yeah, I would attribute the the unsuccessful pitches to that.
Mm-hmm. So more risk in an already risky environment, right? You're not in Allstate, Maine, where things are relatively staid and it's kind of staying the course and it's about growing the business.
Right.
You're in the subsidiary. It's already got a lot of expectations on it. There's tons of risks in the environment. You're coming in with what's perceived as yet another risk.
Yep.
And they're sort of like, cool, we don't need another risk. We got plenty of risks on our own right now.
Yep.
Oh, Florent, you're on mute, bro. Florent, you're on mute, man.
Oh,
there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. And I will be super brief, but I'll just seize the opportunity, by the way, to, I think for the first time, apologize to Jesse, because I've been feeling bad that whole time, because I felt, I didn't know it at the time, but I felt I threw him under the bus. And I felt, yeah, that there was definitely an aspect of being too junior. I think now I would not recommend to a junior behavioral scientist like to jump in as behavioral scientist #1 in a company. And I think the other, like the people, I've seen a few junior people be successful at it, but that was in places that were already running A/B tests. If they are already running A/B tests, you come in and you say, we're going to test this idea, then it might work. But yeah, I think that I did not judge the place correctly, the role correctly. And I wanted to apologize to Jesse because I feel that, yeah, he was thrown into a very, it was a very tough place to start in.
We all love Jesse, man. We're all part of BS. He's grown to be in the same organization as you now. We're all part of BeSci.io. It's good. We love Jesse. But I think it's a really important point. I mean, I've talked to some of the folks on the call I know who are struggling with this right now, where they're the sort of lone behavioral scientist. Maybe it's not a fertile field for them, and they feel like they're put a lot of seeds and not seeing a lot of plants. I do think there are things like, hey, is anybody doing any kind of testing here that are a good thing? I also think, Jesse, to your point, when stuff is really early, People always look at me weird when I say this, but like, I actually don't think that early stage startups and early stage ventures are the right place for behavioral science, because you kind of just have to go on beliefs, because you really only get one shot. Like, there's no experimentation, there's no anything. You're just like, it's operations or bust, right? That makes the beginning of all startups. Either you have the bet right or you have the bet wrong. You have to be a little bit bigger before it starts to make sense, where you can say, hey, we're now big enough and self-sustaining enough that it makes sense to start to run some of these kinds of experimentation things to optimize risk. So you're in here. Did you land any projects? Did any of these pitches pan out?
Yes. So I would say that probably the big success was when I was hired. Allstate had been working with a consultant that started an experiment. When I was brought in, I helped evaluate the results of that experiment and felt like the consultant wasn't doing a great job, but that it was a worthwhile area to continue exploring. So my success was tracing out a path forward along the basically an experimentation agenda to replace or move beyond what the consultants had initially been working on. So that was fulfilling. I was happy to land one. Unfortunately for me, again, maybe because of perceived risk around these crazy new behavioral science ideas, that was put that my ideas were put towards the middle or lower half of the backlog, and whenever I would check in, hey, are you building this? Are you testing this? The timeline kept getting moved out and moved out and moved out. So I identified stuff to work on. I came up with the plans that even got started, getting put into production. But before I could see that come to fruition, we get to the next chapter in our story, which is a headhunter from the far reaches of Western Canada reached out to me and recruited me for a startup. This was the small startup that was entirely devoted to telephone billing that I mentioned in the beginning of our session today. And that was a completely different experience from any of the ones that I described before. Like you said, Matt, it was doing behavioral science. It involved doing behavioral science in an environment where there was very little latitude, very little opportunity to really test and find things out, because there's so much pressure to succeed and grow the business. Very, very fast-paced, very stressful in a way. I would say, on the flip side, one of the advantages of that environment was that I was, for the first time, really close to the product, really close to decision makers. Because it was a small company, they couldn't, help but have me in the room, or I guess on the Zoom call, as it were. And so I had a lot more input into discussions about what to do, what would be best for the business, how to understand customers, than I had previously. So pros and cons.
And so you for the first time really get really direct product experience. You're getting more exposure to the operations business. And it sounds like sort of for the first time, right? In many ways, you're starting to see, we often talk these days about this sort of behavioral business model, behavioral model, operational model. It sounds like this is a part where you're starting to creep out into the operational model. You're starting to see how the rubber actually meets the road a little bit, both in terms of how to grow the business on the business model side, but also just how does this stuff get productionized on the operations side.
Yeah, down to the level of talking with engineers and explaining, like, this is what I need, here is how you do randomization, and this is what I needed to do. yeah, it was definitely eye-opening, and the level of access and hands-on work, uh, particularly in messy work and troubleshooting things.
Yeah, that ability to communicate directly with engineers is really, I think, a formative experience for a lot of behavioral scientists. Where you get really close enough that you're, I love that you picked randomization, because randomization is one of the examples I often use when I talk about people learning those operational bits. Because true random, like, the government, when they want to encode things, they're like sampling atmospheric noise to get to true random is really, 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 really hard.
Right.
What we usually mean is like not in an obvious order, right? Or in an order that changes like in a non-obvious way.
Right.
That's a lot easier to do, it turns out. That's like one line. Randomization, like in the non-obvious way, is one line of code. Randomization in the true random way is not easy at all. So I think that coming to that learning. So it sounds like the big learning from this chapter is really the like, what are people doing with the recommendations I make, and how can I get a little closer to that?
Yeah. That, I would say, that, as well as how to interact with developers and people actually who are doing the technical work. I was able to get a window into that part of applied behavioral science, or product development in a way that I previously had not at larger companies.
And so you're having some success and failures. I'm curious, in this journey, is this increasing your certainty that like behavioral science is the thing that you want to do? Or are you wavering and going, man, maybe this isn't my thing. Maybe I should be somewhere else. Like, you're having these experiences, these trials and tribulations. What's that feel like for you?
Very disorienting. I will say that it was around that time that I started asking other behavioral scientists in the field, do you know where, in the private sector, can I find a company that does behavioral science in kind of like a very routine way, where it's effectively embedded into product development, and that I can use as a model for what I'm trying to do. And what I learned, through knocking on many doors and talking to other folks in the field, is that everybody does it in kind of a different way. There's some general ideas about how to do behavioral science, but there's a lot of tailoring or adaptation of those kind of more general models and processes to the context of wherever you happen to be working. So yeah, your question was how was it for me? Very disorienting, because I had to try to think about balancing, what does the business need me to do? What can I do? Because at this point, I'm still only a few years into my career. What do I enjoy doing? And the Venn diagram of those things don't totally overlap.
Yeah, 100%. And so what makes the decision to sort of then decide that Indeed's going to be the right next step for you? You're there, startup's doing its thing. You're like, this, you were there for like a year and a half.
Right?
A year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, you're in this, you're landing some things, it's feeling good. And then
I decided that I can't work startup hours anymore. It was just too much for me. And a recruiter from Indeed reaches out to me. I actually end up applying twice, and on the second time, I'm hired. And it's at this point that I feel like things have clicked, or I have, let's say, they've started to click. I still feel like I've gone through about 5 years and 4 different jobs in this narrative so far. I still feel like I'm learning how to be a behavioral scientist and how to do behavioral science effectively. But a number of things start to fall into place, once I start to work in Indeed.
let's push on that. Talk to me about that. What feels like it's now clicking differently than, you're mid-career instead of early career?
Yeah.
what feels different, right? Like, I think earlier you talked about, hey, I'm probably better at pitching for business value today than I was before. Like, what skills start to click where you feel like, hey, I really know what I'm doing here?
I think, like you said, figuring out how to explain what behavioral science is and how it can fit into other parts of a company. By that point, I had done that explanation probably dozens of times, and through trial and error, reflection and advice, had figured out how to explain that effectively. So I figured out the business development side of doing behavioral science. I think another thing that helped was I figured out who to direct those pitches to. I stopped doing as many lunchtime talks and started targeting specific decision makers directly. I found that it's great if lots of people in an organization know a thing or two about behavioral science as a result of going to 45-minute talks, but ultimately for a young behavioral science team to succeed, it needs executive support or buy-in from somebody who controls resources and budget. So recognizing where to focus my efforts was crucial. A third thing that was helpful, not related to skill or anything I did, it was circumstance. There had already been a behavioral scientist working at Indeed by the name of Rachel Rosenberg, who trained at Ideas 42, who laid a lot of the groundwork in another part of the company. And so being able to build on the successes of an immensely talented colleague and say, hey, see what they did over there in that division and that part of Indeed? Do you want to sprinkle some of that behavioral science magic over here? I can help. That was a really favorable circumstance that helped me get started.
Yeah, I think that having been the first behavioral scientist everywhere in my career, just because the way the difference in age between us, right? For landing those first couple of projects is so key. Having something that you can point to and sort of say like, "Yeah, did you like that thing? More of that." I often tell the story of, at Microsoft, there's this tendency, I think, sometimes to go for the biggest, meatiest problem, right? The sort of BHAG in the room, and like my first project at Microsoft was definitely not that. It was Klingon in the Bing translator, which is objectively useless, right? Objectively, no one is live is being saved by the Klingon translation part of Bing. But, it got into market, it got really good press, which, if you're Bing, you're getting beat up by Google all day, every day, like, a little positive press that says that you beat Google to a feature feels really good. And that became the sort of like, hey, you want more of that? Let's do this next thing. And the next thing was dramatic. It was being in the classroom, dramatically more serious, dramatic, does actually change behavior that I care about. But having that, and I think, Jesse, I really like that point of like, well, if you're going somewhere where somebody has already done things that you can point to, that's such an accelerant, right? It's such an opportunity to say, hey, more of that.
I want to interject here with a bit of hard-won insight. I think it really matters what you point to, though. I was, fortunate enough that I had my colleague had done some really expansive work around how job candidates are listed when they apply to a job. So some really kind of sweeping work around choice architecture. There were also some smaller examples of individual nudges that I could have pointed to, and a lot of times I found as a new behavioral scientist, which I've been 4 times over in my career, there's pressure to get quick wins. Find the smallest thing that you can to illustrate a behavioral science principle, do that and show people a positive result. And I've found that can sometimes be a trap, because if you become known as the person who does these, very small, very quick behavioral interventions, that's what people are going to ask you for. And so one thing that worked out well at Indeed is that the example I could point to, or an example I could point to, was actually a more sweeping project, a bigger, longer term illustration of what behavioral science could do, and how you think about choice architecture and making a sequence of contributions or changes as a behavioral scientist over time. So figuring out what your first project should be, what first impression you want to make, is really important. And I think one thing, again, by trial and error, I've learned by this point in my career is, those quick nudges can be appealing and they can make a good story, but you don't want to pigeonhole yourself as a person who just does that.
Right, that little tweak at the end.
Yeah.
Right. We've had other guests on where I think we've talked a little bit about how it can sometimes feel like people are like, I brought you this, 99% finished thing. Now add your 1%, and you're like, cool, but the mistake that you made was way back there.
Right.
Way, way back there. And at this point, it's going to be really hard for me to undo it.
Right.
I think that's really prescient. Tell me a little bit about sort of, you've had the opportunity to work across a variety, in finance, a variety of different contexts. How are you choosing, what kind of problems to work on? Are you liking, are you excited about the job space? Were you excited about Indeed, or was it just another opportunity to do behavioral science? Like, tell me a little bit about sort of the industry part of that, of your journey.
Sure. Well, I hadn't actually thought about working in anything related to HR or personnel decisions before Indeed reached out to me. So it was an area that, I was completely new.
And yet harkens back to the very beginning of the story was like the relationship between, private entity and enterprise and sort of capital, human capital.
Yeah.
And so good happenstance there.
Yeah, there's definitely an echo. And it is also sort of meta in a way that I've been able to answer, what do I want to do with my own career by working at a company that helps people start their careers. That is not lost on me. One thing that I like about working in HR tech as an industry or as a niche is that the decisions that you can influence as an applied behavioral scientist are substantive. They really matter. This is not about influencing the decision to buy like a new type of ketchup, where if somebody did or somebody didn't, it would, the world would continue turning and, their life would be virtually unchanged. Figuring out what kind of career you want to take, or on the flip side, who you want to hire, how you present yourself as a candidate, how you sell yourself as an employer, these are really important decisions with real material consequences to people's lives. So I think that's been really appealing. Another part of it is that because Indeed as a company, we think and talk about hiring all day. Well, Indeed hires people themselves. And so there's been an opportunity for me to apply what I've worked on internally within Indeed as well. So being able to do behavioral science both internally and externally has been an added bonus of the job. And it's not every company where what you sell to people also goes on within the company. It's just every company hires, and Indeed does HR tech. So what I work on and what I research applies to both sides of the coin.
Yeah, so there's a fantastic sort of dog fooding opportunity there where you can sort of use your own stuff
Right.
to do the piece. I love that. Favorite projects, stuff that like, that is really memorable for you, stuff along the way that you think, examples that you would, if you were trying to teach people about applied behavioral science, what examples do you use from your own career that really resonate?
One recent one that comes to mind is I've done some work on numeracy, which is numeric literacy. Basically, how well do people understand math? Very basic topics like, do you know what a percent means? Or if you see a bar graph or a line chart, do you make the right inferences from it? Or do you think you make the right inferences from it? But do you actually draw the wrong conclusions or have an outsized sense of success or risk or whatnot? Recently, I've been trying to replicate some work that's been done in like healthcare settings about how you present outcomes and options with different numeric framings. If you show something as a chance as a fraction versus a percent, people interpret that information and act on information differently. So this is ongoing, but I've found so far that simple changes like that can have a big impact on how people make decisions within the HR space. I've also found that the overall level of numeracy across the HR sector is actually pretty low. Well, it matches the numeracy level of the United States as a whole. And sorry, Matt, this is turning into a ramble.
No, I love this ramble. This is a fantastic ramble. So what I'm hearing is, hey, that the numeracy of HR decision makers is not any better than all the rest of our numeracy, right, despite the fact that their job very much depends on literate numeracy, or at least in an ideal world, their job would be heavily influenced by strong numeracy.
I guess it's memorable. It stands out to me because this line of research, kind of showcases a couple of things that a behavioral scientist is, uniquely positioned to point out in an organization. One, people don't think and process information the way we often assume they do. You might assume that people working in HR, especially in big companies, are rational decision makers who are crunching the numbers and looking at data and finding optimal choices about who to hire. And in reality, well, there are some people like that, but there are many people out there who aren't totally sure how to read a line graph or understand what a percent means. And then another component, just quickly, is it also shows, framing effects. If you change a percent to a fraction, and saying that, what is the chance that this person is going to take the job, it can have a big difference on how that information is interpreted. So, very basic topic. Do people get numbers? How well do people get numbers? But there's a lot of different behavioral sciencey strands that go into that work.
100%. And one of the things I feel like I heard you say in there is it's more of an inhibiting pressure problem than a promoting pressure problem. It's not that people don't want to use data and don't want to be evidence driven. They really want to make some sort of intuitive decision, but rather that, the true barrier might be they just aren't quite sure how to use the data to make decisions, and so sort of default back to intuition. Do you think it's motivated, or you think it's sort of more of a gap?
Excellent point. It depends on the person. Some people find math to be off-putting. Some people actually have something called dyscalculia, which is similar or analogous to dyslexia, where they have difficulty processing numbers altogether. Some people think that they know more math than they actually do, and that. It's another example of overconfidence. Again, we're back to behavioral basics. Figuring out how to frame information, create choice architecture for those three groups, that could be a lifetime of work right there.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I want to make sure that we're almost at the hour, and I've been monopolizing your time. If you do have questions, just stick your hand up. There's a little hand raising button at the bottom, and I will promise we'll get to them. Otherwise, Jesse and I will talk about this stuff all day long. I love this sort of numeracy bit. How are projects coming to you? You know, what's the process at Indeed? Is someone coming along and dropping a thing off on your desk and saying, like, here you go, here's the problem? Are you doing a little bit of sort of hunter gathering? Like, how do you find problem? You know, how do things come to you, and how do you hand them back to the business?
First 6 months to a year on the job was a lot of business development, a lot of pitching. Now I'm about halfway into my third year. Time really flies. And I'm known enough around the company as that behavioral science guy, that guy who deals with quirky and ambiguous problems. And a lot of people come to me.
Mm-hmm. Is there a formalized, like, how do you decide what projects to pursue? You know, is that between you and your manager? Like, how are you deciding what to take on?
It's a negotiation between me and my manager, you know, to try to figure out, what the overlap is in that Venn diagram between what the business needs, what I'm able to do just in terms of time and skills and domain knowledge, and then also what I enjoy. So finding the overlap between those three.
I like this. Is that a implicit framework or an explicit framework? Are you explicitly saying, like, I really don't want to do that, but I can do it? Like, you know, how explicit is that framework for choosing?
Pretty explicit. It's a pretty I'm pretty upfront about, you know, if I feel like I have no idea how to tackle a particular problem. And I think recognizing my limitations as a behavioral scientist, there is so much I don't know. I guess we're back to political philosophy now. What is that? The story about Socrates. The oracle in Greece told him he was the wisest man alive because he was able to say, I know nothing. He was able to recognize the limits of his own knowledge, made him a little bit smarter than other people. I'd like to think, I don't always remember it, but I'd like to think that I occasionally recognize when, I'm over my skis and, when I shouldn't take on a project. I guess that's something else I've learned by this point.
Does the business ever push you to take on something that you feel a little over on your skis on, or are they pretty good at protecting your sort of, your ability to do the things that you feel like you can do?
I have not felt pressured indeed to take on something that I don't feel like I'm equipped to do. Sometimes I have to learn things in order to get a project done, but I'm not pushed to do things that I'm unable to learn about or get up to speed about, which has really been nice.
And maybe that's a great way to take us out is, you talked earlier about the importance of community, and one of the things you like about behavioral science is the community of behavioral science. I also enjoy that. I used to, as someone from the New York tech scene, people often asked about comparisons between New York and San Francisco, and I always sort of said New York was a much more collaborative tech scene. San Francisco was a much more competitive tech scene, in part because of, in SF, it's the only game in town, right? In New York, there's finance and fashion and lots of other things that people could go into. And so, that in-group, out-group pressure creates a lot of different kinds of behaviors for people. Are there communities you really enjoy? How do you find other behavioral scientists to talk to, ask questions with? Like, are there communities of practice that you find really valuable? Like, if you were a young behavioral scientist, if you were talking to yourself a while ago, like, is it cold outreach? Is it joining, a club or a Slack or whatever? Like, what do you feel like is the way to start to engage that community for you?
I consume a lot of different behavioral science sources of behavioral science information. So BeSci.o, Action Design, behavioral science LinkedIn is surprisingly active. I hear behavioral science Twitter is also pretty lively, although I'm not on Twitter these days. I think that cold outreach to behavioral scientists is actually a surprisingly effective tactic. It's, not everybody is going to write back, but I found this community to be tremendously generous with its time and its knowledge. Think about all of the different folks who I mentioned over the last 59 minutes that we've been speaking. There's been you, there's been Steve, there's been Florent, so many people who have stepped up to help me and shared their knowledge and hard-won experience. I try to do the same thing for folks who are just getting started in the field when they reach out to me, and I found that there are lots of other people who are willing to do the same. So
you heard it here first. First, everybody send Jesse a note. He's happy to talk to you. Cold outreach for the win. Jesse, thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I know rehashing your career always feels like it's a walk down memory lane, but it is so valuable for people who are starting on this journey or at different points in the journey who need to hear, the validation that, like, hey, it's not all, it's not always going to click, and there are tribulations, and you can overcome those. And you've had such a wonderful career, and I love working with you, and I'm so glad we get to be friends. And so thanks so much for spending some time with me today. Any last words of advice for behavioral scientists as you lead us out?
Last words of advice.
Hopefully not truly last words, Jesse.
Yeah, that sounds a little
more conversation soon.
A little fatal. I would say, I'll just repeat what I mentioned before. Just remember how much there is left to learn, and try to learn it.
I love that. Thanks so much for being with us, Jesse, and everybody today. We'll get the video out to everybody in the community. We'll see you all in the Slack, and keep focusing on behavior, and then using behaviors and outcome science as a process. I'll see you all on down the road. See you, everybody. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Matt.